Good morning to our North American audience and to our European and Middle Eastern audience. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Stratagem and Illumio webinar on From Vulnerable to Invincible, Reinforcing Your Network with Micro-Segmentation. My name is Nisreen Shams. I'm the Assistant Vice President of Business Development at Stratagem, and we're very excited to have some key speakers from a very valuable technology that we've been working with here at Stratagem, and want to share a little bit more about what this is all about. So the agenda for today, of course, a welcome and intro. We will give a nice warm introduction into our special guest, Russell Goodwin, who is a CTO from Illumio. We'll share a little bit more about how Stratagem and Illumio make a better together story and the partnership with that. And also we'll open up for a Q&A. Now, please put your questions into the panel in the right-hand side of this screen. I will come to the questions at the very end, and we'll make sure we get everybody's questions answered today. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Russell Goodwin is a field CTO with Illumio. We're very lucky to have his time today, very busy guy, selling globally. He's a leader in network segmentation, where he helps large and complex organizations successfully deliver zero trust segmentation programs. His background is in networking and security and goes back nearly 3 decades, working in technology, pharmaceutical, energy, telecom, and payments, as well as some big banks globally. So we're very happy to have him. Before I kick it off to Russell, everybody knows in security there are buzzwords that really dominate the industry, right? Every single technology, and there are hundreds of them in this industry, claim that they are going to be that silver bullet to cybersecurity. And we all know that's impossible, right? The way threats are happening in this industry, there is not one single answer to the puzzle. So with that being said, a lot of attention has been put on zero trust. I know AI has taken the stage more recently in terms of this attention, but to kick us off today, I'm going to ask a very simple question to Russell, and why the interest in zero trust?
Nisreen, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invite, so thank you. Yes, okay, so zero trust, why the interest? I think that zero trust has been around for some years now. As you say, it's gone through its stage of being a buzzword where everyone tried to attach themselves to it. I think with the advent of the AI interest, that's settled down a bit, and I think that's helping to clarify the situation somewhat. But if we look at why zero trust is interesting, I think that's really a great place to start, right? So the focus has come about really for many reasons, right? And one of the principal reasons is the increasing visibility of breaches, ransomware being one example, right? But this has been growing, and the size and scale and visibility of these breaches in the last few years has really just gone up and up. And if you look at some of the breach reports from parties like IBM, they share a lot of information about the scale and size and cost of these breaches, and really the direction is only one way. And if we look back to, for example, 2017, here in the UK, I'm based in the UK, the National Health Service had a big problem with ransomware called WannaCry, and this cost around $120 million in costs related to impact to healthcare services. And in fact, that beyond the NHS, that ransomware impacted around 200,000 devices globally. Fast forward a bit to 2020, we had SolarWinds. This was very high profile. This cost approximately 90 million in insured losses, plus the cost to SolarWinds themselves, and they were subject to somewhere around 26 million in fines and about 18 million in associated costs, right? And then again, moving forward to 2021, Colonial Pipeline happened, and this was a very, very visible impact, and less so around the dollar value that was attached to this, but more that I think the reality struck that these incidents, these breaches, ransomware attacks, don't just affect corporations and companies, they affect people, because this is where there was a large disruption to fuel supplies on the east coast of the US. People couldn't fill their cars up. So it became, I think, at this stage, very visible. And a lot of this, there's a big industry built around this, but also there's nation state activity, and this is the big concern, right? It's not just foreign nation state actors, it's groups in those countries potentially either supported or simply allowed to continue with these activities. And then there's the supply chain attacks like SolarWinds, which means you don't just have to protect yourself against breaches and concerns from the internet, from the outside. You have to worry about how those things are propagating through your supply chain, through your partners, through your, through your suppliers. So with that, I think there became a lot of focus also from regulators and from governments. We saw the NIST Zero Trust Architecture first published in 2020. And then immediately following Colonial Pipeline, in the same month, we had the executive order from the US President's Office, Order 14028. And that really set out that anybody or any agencies working in the government or their suppliers had to start addressing this with zero trust methodologies, and specifically segmentation was called out. There's obviously also the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. They released their zero trust maturity model in 21. And then they were followed also by other foreign governments as well. So we're seeing activity here in the UK from the National Cybersecurity Centre. They also released Zero Trust Principles in 2021. And now we also have NIS2 from the European Union, and we have DORA coming, which is due to become enforceable in January next year. So a lot of government and regulatory oversight as well, on top of all of the activity in the threat space.
That's very, very interesting. Now Russell, we love simplicity in technology, as you know, and we don't really get that in the market. So can you really boil down for us in simple language, what is zero trust?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and there's a lot of noise. So, and especially when a lot of companies that sell different products try to attach themselves to zero trust, it does muddy the landscape. But I think a great place to start is probably with Forrester. So Forrester, a research company, they really coined the phrase zero trust back in 2009. And actually there was a specific analyst, a gentleman called John Kinderberg, who is actually now working at Illumio, but he was the analyst that first coined the term zero trust. And it's really based on 3 key principles. And we'll dig into this, right? But fundamentally also it goes back to the origins of just least privilege, which has been around for a very long time, and the principles of applying least privilege. So if we look at the principles, like the first one at the top here is that all entities are untrusted by default. And what this really means is your environment should not contain any implicit access. And in fact, in most enterprises, most businesses, small or large, there's a lot of implicit access in the network, and we'll get to that. Next, it's about this principle of least privilege. And really this comes down to when you do grant access to something, whether it be an individual or a system, that access should be restricted to the minimum possible, that as required. And then the third principle here is really just about monitoring. And really comprehensive monitoring means you should have visibility of what's going on. And visibility is hugely important because not only does it inform the actions you need to take in your zero trust journey, but also it helps you measure your approach, it helps you measure your progress, and obviously it helps you to identify when activity is happening, such as breaches, right? So I think really, honestly though, zero trust aside, this is really just about common sense in practice, to be honest. And zero trust talks about 5 pillars, and we'll get to those as well, right? So this is the second graphic from Forrester. And 5 pillars of zero trust, it really centers around data being the central pillar, right? And this is ultimately what you're trying to protect. And it could be intellectual property, it could be customer data, it could be financial data. It doesn't really matter, but it's anything that's important to you and holds value. You want to be able to protect that. And the surrounding pillars really represent the things and people that are trying to access that data, right? And this is where you need to be applying your zero trust principles. So we have people on the left, and these are the individuals that work with you. It could be your partners, it could be your staff, anyone that's accessing your data. The workloads and devices are really what they're using to access that data. And on the right, you have networks. And networks is really where that access is coming from. And ultimately, the goal here with zero trust is to protect the data in the middle from all of those other pillars and make sure that any access into that kind of green zone you see there is again limited by this principle of least privilege, etc. And then you see an overlay here at automation orchestration. We'll come to that a bit later, but those are very important because I think if you can leverage automation, which many companies, if they're not already doing it, it's an aspiration. It allows you to be much more consistent in how you apply your policy. And visibility and analytics is really about seeing what's happening and about measuring your results, if you like. And Nisreen, the last thing I want to say really before we move on is I think the mentality, to boil it down to the simplest thing, the mentality you need to employ here is to assume breach. And this is a phrase we use, it's used elsewhere as well. But what assume breach really means is that you should not trust anything in your environment. You should behave as if anything you already own, whether it be your servers, whether it be your laptops, assume they're already breached. Now, obviously, day to day, you hope that's not the case, but it will inevitably happen. And if you apply your controls based on that expectation, then you're going to be able to protect yourself and limit the damage that happens, when that unfortunately, inevitably occurs.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Kind of a two-part question. Do you find organizations that you're working with are taking this mentality of assuming breach? And in addition to that, what are the barriers to really implementing zero trust?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the barriers that probably the mental barriers that people come up against when they're thinking about zero trust is it's daunting, right? Like people, it's one of those problems that, often people don't know where to start. And in practice, I think that's usually more a reflection on the delta between where you think you are today and where you need to be. So when people look at that, they think this looks like a very big problem. I obviously need to do something, right? But I don't know how to go about doing those things. So I think that's one of the key barriers. The other thing is that, sometimes we see, and I've been doing segmentation network security for a long time before I was at Illumio. But one of the problems as well is that sometimes senior management, people think, I can get zero trust by buying some products, right, or employing a technology or writing a policy document. And really, it's more holistic than that. It really comes down to cultural, company culture, company behavior. You have to use products and technology to provide those capabilities, but it's really at its core, it's more probably about operational behavior. And often there's change required in that behavior. And I think that can be a barrier as well, because that, again, for technologists and security professionals, they can think about the products they're going to use, but when they think about how they're going to change culture and behavior in the organization, this can be a bit more of a bit more daunting to look at as well. And of course, like I said, you don't just buy products to become zero trust, right? You need those solutions, but ultimately it takes time. And I think also people need to accept that, like this, it can be daunting because it looks like it's going to take a lot of time. But that's fine. It's not going to happen overnight. It does take time, and ultimately, I think people just need to become comfortable with that, if I'm honest.
Makes sense. So in that way, you'd say zero trust is not really a point-in-time event. It's perhaps more of an evolution, an ongoing process. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. It's a bit of a tired analogy, but it's a journey, right? People will say this all the time, right? You need to think, first of all, like I said, it's not a product or a technology or a design, it's kind of a set of principles. So you need to really think about that, I guess think about what you're trying to achieve, keep focused on the objective, right, and realize that it's a journey. And I think you have to just accept that. Now, whether the timeline, depending on your objectives, is to achieve that outcome in 5 years, the important thing is that you need to start and you need to make progress, right? So, ultimately, it's a big thing to achieve, but that doesn't mean you can't get value very quickly, right? And you can mitigate serious risks and you can make significant progress very quickly. So I think that's important. And it's an evolution, not just in that, like in the way you deliver the program, but it's an evolution, like I said, in organizational change, culturally, processes, and cultural change in organization also does not happen overnight.
Absolutely. So how would someone working currently on a zero trust journey go about implementing these changes?
Yeah, I think so. This is really important, and the reason it's important is, as we said, it can be very daunting to get started. So I think the first thing people need to think about is how they're going to go ahead and execute on this, right? Build a plan. Always helps to have a plan. So one of the key things I think is that, because like I said, it requires organizational change, it's really important to have organizational support, right? And depending on the size of your business, right, that can be, if you like, relatively simple. You might have an individual or a senior exec that really has control over the entire business from top to bottom, and they can kind of like give their stamp of approval and get everyone heading in the right direction. In large enterprises, and we do a lot of work with large enterprises, it's complex because you have lots of silos in different parts of the business, and you need to ultimately find support somewhere that can, if you like, lay the edict down to the rest of the business that everyone needs to get on board and make those changes. So probably one of the biggest things about achieving zero trust is, like I said, it's not a technology or a product. It's about executive support, right? So it's about getting the right support from the business to go and deliver on this, right? And then once you've got that, I think I mentioned about the journey, and it's really important that you do not try and do it all in one go, because you're going to get stuck every time, right? There's this phrase, analysis paralysis, where you spend so much time thinking about the problem that you don't really get started, right? So you have to accept you're not going to do it all at once. You have to find achievable and beneficial objectives you can achieve on the journey, and you need to focus on those, you need to deliver those, and then you iterate, right? Once you've achieved some wins, you move on, you do the next thing. So it's really about getting started, right? And I think that what we see is that once you start that process and you start to make progress and you start to get value and you start to mitigate risk, then the rest will come. You get momentum, the business gets behind you, and you can make progress. And in fact, there's a lot of benefits when it's operationally to doing this. So I think once the business gets to see that, then you tend to build a head of steam and you tend to make good progress.
So we know that zero trust is not a product per se, but we also do know that technology will be an essential core driving factor behind this. So talk to us, bring those two concepts home. How do they fit together?
Yeah, so I kind of labored the point there a little bit about how zero trust is not like you don't buy a product and you get zero trust. But at the same time, we're technologists, and ultimately solving these problems requires technology. And it's about identifying the right technology, identifying the products that are going to help you meet those needs. So we can kind of look at some of the typical products or technologies that people use to go ahead and deliver a zero trust program. And obviously we're going to talk a bit more in depth about segmentation today, which is what we focus on, right? But also, ZTNA is a common target. So this is like zero trust network access, and this really helps you protect the edge, and it helps you reduce your attack surface at the edge. Identity and access management is important because this is really where you plug in the identities and understand about the individuals that you're trying to control in that zero trust pillar on the left there, the people. But also, and I'll move on actually to the next slide here. But obviously, both of those help protect you with access to the application. But what they don't do is they do not help you prevent the spread of attacks or breaches inside the organization, right? And this is why I think segmentation is such an important key element. And often it's the one that, identity is often looked at very early. ZTNA is a very common thing. I think that space is very mature and there's a lot of products in that space. But segmentation is actually a really key enabler to enable zero trust. And it's because if you, again, assume this breach mindset, then it allows you to understand that once the breach happens and there's a device or workload or something in your environment that suffered that breach, you're able to limit the damage that does, how it can move and laterally across the environment, how it can pivot, how that breach can spread. And especially when you look at something like ransomware, containing the breach to the absolute minimum surface is the thing that's going to significantly reduce the impact to your business, and it's going to reduce the cost and the reputational damage and all these things. So preventing lateral movement is, and which you achieve typically with segmentation, is a really important part of the technology stack you need to employ.
Excellent. So we started with a little bit on what is zero trust, all the hype around it, and obviously talked a bit about segmentation, which is what Illumio is known for. So can you kind of bring both concepts home for us and give us an idea of how both play into one another?
Yeah, okay. So I think, having touched on the background about zero trust and the objectives and how you run the program, getting a bit more into the technology and how you go about achieving that, I'm going to talk a bit more about zero trust segmentation and kind of explain what it is and why it's beneficial. So, zero trust segmentation, right, and the network. So this gives you a bit of context around what zero trust segmentation really is, and it gives you some ideas about how it can help you advance your security program, but also it gives you some ideas about how it's operationally beneficial and how it can be a useful tool to also help your business become more agile and more cost effective, right? So segmentation, when you use a product like Illumio, one of the fundamental principles about the product is it allows you to separate, your security layer from your network layer. And traditionally, a lot of network security technologies focused on network infrastructure, things like firewalls or proxy servers, those type of things, right? And you typically did your enforcement somewhere in the network. Increasingly as well, the network, which ultimately its primary objective is to deliver traffic. That's kind of what the network fundamentally, historically was designed to do. But because of the requirement to implement security, often the network has become, and this graphic you see in the background here kind of highlights this, is becoming increasingly complex. And what I mean by that is that there are various technologies that you implement the network, and it started with VLANs, and if anyone remembers the private VLANs, if anyone had experience with those, and then you have other virtualization technologies like VRFs and MPLS, and and now SDN and VXLAN, all these type of things. And there are different reasons to implement these technologies, but it was pretty common to implement these as a mechanism to apply security. And what that basically meant is that you would architect the network in such a way that as traffic passed from one place to another, it was steered or directed through network enforcement points where policy could be applied, right? And as the, if you like, the threat profile moved away from north-south and it moved towards east-west, and the explosion, first of all, with virtualization, but then with containerization, the majority of traffic in the environment is now east-west. It goes from one server to another, one application to another, microservices, etc. There's a lot of lateral movement of traffic inside the environment. It becomes increasingly challenging to enforce that using network technology, because you now need an ever-increasing complexity in the network to drive traffic through your enforcement points. You need more enforcement points. The number of firewall policies increases. Operational cost of change, cost of complexity goes up. The network in some ways is compromised, not from a security standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, because you're now buying a lot of complexity in the network to ultimately achieve a security outcome. So what Zero Trust segmentation does really is it allows you to separate those two things. It allows the network to do what the network does, deliver traffic, do it performantly, efficiently, resiliently, etc. And it allows you to do your security control independent of that, right, on specifically on the endpoint. So it kind of separates, so sort of separating the network from the security layer.
So can you give us a bit more detail on how exactly Illumio goes about and separates the security from the network? What's the process there?
Yeah, so the technology, and Illumio is not the only one that does this, but it's certainly the direction of travel, right? But Illumio is the leader in this space. What we really pioneered going back around 10 years or so when we first brought the product to market was doing the security on the endpoint. And unlike previous technologies that kind of did this, like maybe it's McAfee or something, that where you could write a firewall policy on your endpoint, it was incredibly difficult to orchestrate, to administer, and really no one did that, right? Because you needed to go off and program thousands of endpoints. You need to work out what the policy is in those endpoints. The different approach that we take with our product is that we have a centralized policy, similar to what you might have if you have a centralized firewall policy platform, but then you have a fully distributed enforcement model. So you define your policy in a single place. And when I say a single place, it can be a single place even for organizations up to 200, 300,000 servers. So it works at very large scale. You define your policy in that place, and then the platform works out where that policy needs to be applied and how it needs to be applied, and it applies it at the endpoint. And some of the benefits of this is you, again, like I said, you kind of you remove the dependency. So now you can have your policy on the endpoint. If the endpoint moves, either it goes to cloud or it moves to a different data center. If we virtualization move, the policy moves with the workload. And it also means that your security posture isn't determined by your network infrastructure. So we've had where they are, for example, wanting to implement a Zero Trust program, and they're saying, but we have all these legacy switches in one of our data centers. We need to upgrade all our switches before we can implement our security model. And the answer is that you don't have to do that, right? You can separate the two. The network can be built as the network should be built, and you can get on and do your security program.
So the policy is not applied in the network, but on the end devices themselves. Can you give us a bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. You know, and we do support integration with certain network enforcement points for certain reasons, but the vast majority and by far the best approach is to have the security policy applied as close to the device as possible. For some of the reasons I mentioned, like around policy movement of the device, if you're doing new platforms, cloud migrations, it allows you to move the policy with the device. It also means that you can apply uniform policy across different environments. Again, physical, virtual, containerized, in the cloud, etc. You can write a consistent policy and apply it everywhere. And it's also common, for customers to start out applying segmentation and still use their existing architecture, but then over time they can, if you like, simplify their infrastructure, get rid of some of the complexity, and lower the cost of operation of their infrastructure. And we'll come to this, right? But this is further enabled by using metadata-based policy, which we'll come to. But Illumio uses a metadata-based policy, and again, that further separates the link between your security policy and your network constructs, which again has the same outcome of simplifying your security policy and differentiating it, and, like, if you like, decoupling it from your network infrastructure.
So define for us more on meta-based policy and how that really differentiates itself from the traditional way that it's been done.
Yeah, so let's and it's just, by the way, some visual here about some of the complexity you might see in your network from doing security with the traditional approach. Okay, so moving on to some metadata-based policy. So I think this is one of the biggest benefits of using Illumio specifically, right? And this is really about changing your policy from a network-centric model where you use IP addresses and that kind of stuff, it's fairly static, to using what we'd call an intent-based policy, right? And an intent-based policy, really what you do is you describe what the policy does and what its outcome should be. You don't necessarily describe how it achieves those outcomes. And one of the benefits of doing it this way, right? Well, there are many benefits, but first of all, it allows, so Illumio then can work out how to implement the policy based on what the outcome should be, which reduces change, right? You can think of it as more of a declarative policy, if you like. And it uses a natural language, which is good because it's self-documenting, right? So what you do is you describe what the policy should do in basically pretty much plain language. And that simplifies your change processes, right? Because the requesting teams that are working with this now do not need to try and do this whole translation. Like, I want my app to talk to their app, and what IP addresses are in my app and what IP addresses in their app, and I want to create a change request with all the right IP addresses, and maybe there's a typo, maybe I missed one out or something. It really simplifies that so that the business can articulate what they want from a policy perspective in language that is relevant to them. So they can describe, my application can talk to their application. It's also adaptive, and what I mean by this is, because again, you're abstracting your policy away to that language. If you describe that my app talks to that app, if there's a new server deployed in your app, you just label it my app, and the policy then basically recalculates to say, okay, so the same is still true. My app talks to that app, but now my app contains one or two more servers, etc. So it's adaptive, and that helps with business agility, business velocity. It allows you to get changes out, and it also means your change process is going to be less prone to error or problems, to be honest, right? And ultimately what that really means is, in practice, is you're going to have less firewall policy changes, and every firewall policy change is the opportunity for error. And on one hand, the error might be that the policy isn't complete and it doesn't work, and you have to refactor that and do that again. But the other angle of that is that the policy could be overly permissive and everything works fine and you don't realize, right, and the policy becomes too permissive. So ultimately, this really reduces your operational change and the amount of labor you have to spend on managing firewall policies, which frees up those resources, right, to do more important work, to be honest, right? And as a side effect, it gives you competitive advantages, right? Because it allows you to move more quickly. It allows you to adopt a DevOps mindset, which is becoming ever more prevalent. Companies want to develop DevOps or DevSecOps mindsets because it allows them to go faster, deliver value, and outpace their competitors as well. So it allows you to secure things that were difficult to secure before, just due to change management process. And because the state of the policy is dynamic and the intent of the policy can remain, remains the same, it means that it's much simpler to understand your change management and risk management processes as well.
So how different is this to work with for those that use approaches like firewalls today?
Yeah, so I think it provides significant simplification because, like I said, rather than having to manage large quantities of IP-based policy, which can be pretty opaque to look at, like to understand what they do, you can write your policy with metadata, and that reduces the sheer volume of policy you have to write, and it simplifies it, and it's in plain language. But it also means it's much easier to audit the firewalls. And we'll come to this a little bit later in the way the adaptive policy works, but it also means that you need to spend less time worrying about stale policy, which is a long-standing traditional problem with firewalls, is that people implement policy, then when services get decommissioned or deprecated, they don't know exactly which policies are associated to those. They don't delete the policies, and you end up with all of this excess stale policy in your firewalls, which no one really understands. But no one, and I'm sure people watching will relate to this, people just leave it because they think it's safest to leave it. And you end up with a large amount of, the older the firewalls get, the more that policy kind of builds up.
So how would this fit into the plans for those moving to DevOps or DevSecOps and automation?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned the fact that it gives you more agility in the business and more velocity because it's adaptive, it can adapt directly to changes. But on top of that, it's also readily automatable. The whole product is API driven effectively. So what we see with many customers is some element of self-service becomes part of the deployment. And this can mean that, if you have a small organization with a centralized DevSecOps function, they can build the policy building directly into the CI/CD pipeline. So as part of the promotional model, when they deploy services, you basically use infrastructure as code to write the policy. And again, similarly, as things change, as things get decommissioned, those things can be reduced. So we see a lot of that with customers using automation tools. Also, it allows delegation. So if in a large organization you have many teams that are developers that are building applications, etc., you can use RBAC functionality based on the metadata to delegate that work down to those teams, and they can write their own policies, etc. And it gives them freedom to develop without having to go through, a central. And we'll talk a bit more about that, I think, shortly. But again, it gives you better agility and it allows you to kind of embrace that mindset.
So can you talk a little bit more about the business benefits of delegation?
Yeah, so I mean, so Illumio conceptually, I think there was two really important things around building a product like this, and that is that a lot of our early customers were very large organizations, finance banks. We have a really large penetration in global banks, and the reason this is I think that they're trying to achieve better segmentation because they often have very flat networks, very open networks, and they have borders between some areas, but typically there's a lot of sort of flatness, if you like, to the network. So taking this approach, it allows them to get to a finer grained level of segmentation, but in a much more scalable way. And it's not just the technical scalability, more importantly, it's the operational scalability. So the policy engine means that, first of all, I've mentioned we have customers with hundreds of thousands, several hundred thousands of servers. But what you can do is, because the whole policy model and the RBAC model is built on metadata, you can also do delegation where you can delegate policy down to parts of the business, whether that be delegate it to the security team that runs a certain country or a certain business unit. You can delegate it down to application teams, etc. So from a business perspective, it's beneficial because you get much better business scalability. If you want to write a much finer grain, if you've got an objective to get to zero trust and you want to write much more fine grained policy, conceptually you might think there's going to be a lot more policy needs to be written, and the way you achieve that successfully is by doing delegation, typically, right, in large organizations. So you give the ownership of a policy for an application to that team, and they understand the application, they write the policy. There can be an approval process. We have functionality to provide oversight, so they can only work within certain boundaries. But again, this is a benefit of metadata, is that you can limit those boundaries based on that metadata. You can say, one team can run application 1 in production, another team can run application 2 in production, etc.
So can you share a bit more about how does metadata policy work in practice? And also, what would that mean for those really managing the policy?
Yeah, okay, so I think at this stage, what I'll do, I've got a slide on Illumio's policy structure, and this kind of can put this into more context around how the policy structure really works, right? So when we think about metadata policy implementation in Illumio, what we do is we have a policy structure which, as you can see here, it's dimensional, which I'll explain in a second. It's hierarchical, it's scalable, inheritable, comprehensible, delegable, all of these things, right? And the way it kind of works, if you can kind of visualize the policy structure, if you like, in this dimensional aspect, and I'm sort of visualizing 3 dimensions here, but you can, and by the way, we do generally, when we work with customers, try and keep, we think simplicity is the best approach, and our policy model is designed to really work very well with simplicity. But you can have more dimensions, but typically 4 or 5 is what achieves the ideal outcome for most customers and makes it supportable, etc. So for example, in these 3 dimensions here, you can imagine you have different environments. Here we have test, development, production. You have some apps, business applications, app 1, app 2, app 3, and you have some different servers in those applications, for example, the web and the app and the database layer. So when we talk about dimensionality, so I can, sorry, I'll give some examples.
Yes, go ahead, actually. You can do that.
Okay, so one example could be, if I want to write a policy that affects all of production, I can write that policy with just a single label and say, this policy applies to every production. And this is great from an operational scale point of view, because you can literally write a single policy that affects all of production. And as servers come and go from production, they get added and they get removed. They just get added and removed to the policies, because the policies, like I say, it's intent-based. So if they're in production, they get the policy for production. Equally, you can write using 2 dimensions, you can write a more specific policy. So for example, in this example, the policy applies to all web servers in production, right? So you might have a specific policy that, that your web development team have access to all the web servers in production, right? And again, you can use that with 2 dimensions, and you can become more focused in how you write that policy. And then in a kind of third example, you can be incredibly granular, right? You can say, for example, the app server in production in app 1 is able to access the web server of app 2 in production. And that's this is where it's kind of hierarchical and dimensional, because you can also use groups of this as well. So an example would be, I could write a policy for all of Europe, and I could just have a label called Europe, and I could apply it to everything in Europe, and I could write a policy for that. But similarly, I could label my workloads in Germany, France, Switzerland, etc. I can put them in a group for Europe. I can write a policy for Europe, but then I can write a separate policy that applies just to Switzerland. And for some organizations, especially global ones, this is useful because Switzerland has different, rules around data residency and all these type of things, right? But equally, you can apply that in any company, large or small, where you can write a very holistic policy, for example, that applies to the whole of Active Directory, or you can write very specific policy that applies to a specific application. And this allows you, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of iterate and make steps and progress towards zero trust without going all the way in one step. You can write a policy, for example, to say that development can't talk to production, right? You can write some exclusions from that if you need to for some reason, but you can write a very broad policy, and you can get a lot of value very quickly. If that makes sense. And operating system is another common one where people might use a dimension there as well.
We did have a question come in the chat, Russell. Do you mind if we take that now?
Yep, we can. Yep, absolutely.
So I can read it out to you. So a question by Sai Pulagralu, if I said that correctly. So he asks, how does it work with change management, audit, and traceability?
Yeah. Okay. So it depends on your implementation. It depends if you're using automation or if you're using the native product tools. The product is entirely based on RBAC control. So similar to many products, when you log in, you'll typically use a single sign-on account to log into the product. And then any changes you make are controlled by your RBAC permission. So, and that is not just what you can do, like can I write policy, can I view data, can I make other, can I create users, but it also is applied based on label. So for example, based on your permissions, you might have access to see certain things or do certain things, but not have access or have visibility of other parts of the organization. And anytime any action is taken, that is fully audited, right? And that's sent typically also to the SIEM or to your SOAR or something as well, so it's centrally controlled. But it does mean that every action is RBAC controlled and every action is auditable and recorded, so you can see who took what actions at what time. Hopefully that answers the question.
That's excellent. Thank you. I'll go back to my question list now. So other than using simple language to write policies, how else does it help with operations?
Yeah, so there are other operational benefits to using this type of policy model, right? So first of all, it's inheritable. And what I really mean by this is, what I really mean by this is, as I said, if you write a policy for production, anytime you add a server that's part of production, it gets that policy. If you remove that device, label metadata, so it's not in production anymore, it gets removed from the policy. So it provides, some self-cleaning capability as well. And what this really means that operationally, the vast majority of day-to-day changes we see at customers don't necessarily require policy change. Really, the only time you need to make policy change is when, if you like, you're making a functional change, like we're deploying a new service, there's a new capability, and that requires a policy change. And that means operationally, there's just a lot less change. And other than the effort involved in change, obviously, there's also a risk involved in any change that the change goes wrong. So it simplifies the operational flow as well, reducing the amount of change in the environment. And it also means operationally you need to spend less time trying to clean up policy, because the policy has this kind of like inherent ability to clean itself up as it goes. And if you were to leave a policy, a metadata-based policy there, which didn't have any objects labeled that way, then first of all, you can report on that. But secondly, the way the linkage between the metadata and your objects works means that that policy wouldn't be applied to any IP addresses, and you don't get this operational problem where you reuse an IP address and the new device kind of inherits the access that the last device has if it wasn't removed from the policy. And one other thing I'd say is, it's very comprehensible, meaning that if your SOC is doing an investigation or if you're doing an audit, you can also look at the policy, and the policy, because it's in natural language, the policy says what it does, and it does what it says, right? So from an audit perspective, it's very easy to search for policies that affect certain things, and it's very easy to look at policy and see what it does.
That's great. So kind of bringing it all home, Russell, we started up talking about zero trust, and then we kind of built into the principles of zero trust segmentation. So how does implementing a solution like Illumio really kind of get you off on a good footing, a good path towards a zero trust journey?
Yeah, okay. So I think, we started off by describing the principles and the pillars of zero trust, and how various products and especially segmentation is a key enabler to get to zero trust. So we can sort of quickly now go through, link it back, so you can say, okay, so how do the product capabilities and the technology help you meet your zero trust objectives, right? So the first one of the three principles we talked about was visibility, right? And that's having a window into your environment, seeing what's happening. And the product provides a lot of visibility tools. So first of all, it provides maps, which you can explore and click into. You can run queries in the maps to find out, like, show me all the interactions between, for example, show me every time development and production are talking to each other. Show me everything that's involved with, application X, etc. There's also, all the data is also streamed to, you can stream it to your SIEM, to your SOC, etc. So you have visibility there as well, and you can do correlations. But also the platform also provides like a tabular view, a queryable tabular view, like you just see in a little extract at the bottom there, where you can kind of run a query and say, look, show me everything related to a certain application, and you can see all the flows, you can see all the interactions, the processes that are involved, how many flows happen between which dates, you can do time-bound queries. So it gives you a lot of visibility into what's happening in your environment. And this is obviously the reason it's so important for zero trust is one of the challenges people have when trying to implement zero trust is you have to start writing a policy. And a lot of people, the first question is, okay, so what access is required to this application? And the truth is that very rarely do people know exactly what is required, right? Like even the application teams, there's been churn in the team, the app's been there 5 years, no one's really entirely sure. So visibility is very important, so you can kind of like put a stake in the ground and say, yeah, I know what's happening in my environment, and thus I can go ahead and start constructing policy. And that leads on to the second point, right, which allows you to write that fine-grained metadata-based policy, which gives you that zero trust control where you can provide least privilege access to the devices, right? And you can write that based on metadata here. There's a number of other levers you can pull around user identity, processes, those type of things, but you can be very explicit. And like I said, there's flexibility that you can write very broad policy, or you can be very explicit down to the port level, process level, if you want to, around exactly what access can happen. And ultimately, that's the, if you like, the dream of zero trust, is to be able to do that. So the product provides you the capabilities that you can get to that destination. And then, you know, the point about it being adaptive and it reducing operational change, this helps you achieve those zero trust outcomes. It allows you to move more quickly, but also importantly, it allows you to do it with lower risk and lower impact, etc. So it's an important supporting factor to delivering any zero trust program. And I mentioned about it being self-cleaning, in so much as things get removed from the environment, they get removed from policy, etc. And it also allows you to embrace automation. And that was one of that kind of overlays that we had on the zero trust pillars. Is automation is very important because it allows you to not only inherit that like DevSecOps mindset, but it allows you to get consistency and predictability in the way you're deploying services. And finally, of course, it's highly scalable. So it works in environments from the very small to the very large. And it's important that it's technically scalable, but honestly, it's more important that it's operationally scalable, because, you know, for an organization to be successful with any zero trust program, they need to be able to operate this, and they need to be able to report and in many cases demonstrate to auditors, you know, what they've achieved. Okay, and I think that probably wraps up that section, I think.
Fantastic. We do have a few more minutes. I have a few more questions here that we wanted to ask.
Yep.
So what happens if metadata is not readily available?
Yeah, so I've talked a lot about metadata-based policy and the benefits, and metadata is beneficial far beyond segmentation, right? In fact, metadata allows you to understand. And by the way, if you look at a lot of the regulation, but also the guidelines that are coming out of in this guidance, from the guidance documents, understanding your environment is also very important from the security perspective, but also, you know, it's beneficial from other business reasons. Like, you know, we've seen customers that are running services that that should have been decommissioned years ago, and they're still running, and they get discovered during this process, and there's costs associated to that, right? Operational costs, support costs, etc. So metadata is very important, but you know, it's extremely common for it to be not widely available, right? And I think it's important to understand that you can make really significant progress without extensive metadata. You know, if you've got a metadata store, and we have an integration with ServiceNow, you can get that very readily. But if you don't have that, you know, you can often derive some of the most important data just from things like host names, IP address information. You know, if you want to understand who owns which applications or which applications sit on which servers, often, you know, the change management systems know that, because, you know, they need to have a process for managing risk and change. So often there are assigned, you know, contacts for servers. So there are many places you can get that data, but it is important to understand that you can make very, I think, you know, very serious progress towards a zero trust program, even with very limited data. And, you know, just for an example, if you wanted to separate in dev and prod, which is a common use case, you really know, all you need to do is have a pretty good understanding of what's in dev and what's in prod, and you can achieve a huge mitigation.
That's excellent. I guess a final question for you here, Russell, is for those of us going down the path of zero trust, you know, wherever we may be, what would be kind of your parting advice to help prevent people from getting stuck or people from making slow progress? What's your advice?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to it earlier on, but the number one thing, and it's the simplest thing, is that you just need to get started, right? Like, I think, you know, again, it comes back to this idea of a journey. You know, if you ever go on a big journey, it can be daunting, but every journey begins with a step, right? Which is, again, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's entirely true. And, you know, if the problem looks too big, or you don't understand the scale of the problem, you're not sure where to start, you just need to get started. Find a tactical win, find something where you can start to make progress. And honestly, as you progress on that journey, it will kind of reveal itself, if you like. Things become clearer. And of course, you know, if you're struggling with that, you can always engage, you know, with us, with Stratagem, you know, with Illumio. You know, we have a lot of experience with doing this. So, you know, if you're really not sure where to start, have a conversation with someone, right? And I think there's plenty of places you can get some guidance just on where is that first step going to be.
Fantastic, Russell. With that being said, I want to conclude the webinar. We will be sending out a thank you email to everybody who attended today with kind of next steps, how to reach me, how to reach Russell. And if anyone is interested in further engaging and discussing, there will be a way to find us back through the email channel. We do have one final slide here. We don't want to kind of leave without mentioning that obviously Stratagem, in partnership with Illumio, we have a managed offering for this. So we will be able to take Illumio and really embed it into the larger cyber mesh architecture, which we've built so much success around here in North America and in the Middle East as well. So we'll be able to work collaboratively with the experts here at Stratagem and your team to action the findings, and as well report on actionable intelligence provided by the team, both for the executive level and the technical level in the organization. So again, the whole concept is you'll have multiple technologies out there trying to really say that this is the path forward, which it is if you have the right management underneath it all, right? So it's a part and parcel solution. So with that being said, I want to thank everybody for their time. I wish everybody a great rest of their day, and we'll chat very soon in another setting. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much, Rosina. I really appreciate it.